Let's talk about senses. Now, this is an area actually of special interest to me. This is probably the one area of neuroscience that I am most interested in. This is related to what I did my own work in. So, if we assume that consciousness is something that happens in the brain, mostly specifically in the cerebral cortex of the brain, we need to think about how that brain gets information about the world, because the brain is going to be directing the body to interact with the world in ways that help us survive. But to do that, it has to have a sense of what's going on in the world. It has to have that internal model. And to have that model, it has to get information. Now, that doesn't sound like a difficult thing. We all live in a sensory world. We live in a world where we are bringing in information about the world all the time. But when you really think about it, it gets pretty interesting. So consider this. Assuming that consciousness is something that happens in the brain, your brain doesn't really have any senses. The brain does not respond to light. If you open up the skull and shine a light on there, you won't have the sensation of seeing. The brain doesn't hear. If you play a sound, if you put a speaker on that opening and play sound in there, you won't get the sensation of sound from that. It also does not have touch or pain. Brain surgery can be done on a person who's awake as long as you anesthetize them to go through the skull, and sometimes is. So, if the part of our brain that is conscious doesn't have those senses, what does it have? And the answer to that is this. The only language the brain understands in terms of information is patterns of action potentials coming in on neurons. Every sense you have, as far as we know, manifests as changes in the series of nerve signals, action potentials, coming into the cells of the brain. Which means that in order to have a sense, we need a transducer. So this process of transduction. We've talked about this a little bit when we talked about membrane receptors, and that is kind of an analogous situation. Just like how in a cell, to get information into the cell, you needed something in the membrane which would respond to something outside the cell by causing a change inside the cell. In the same way, for your brain to have a sense, you need something in your body which responds to a stimulus here in the outside world, like light or sound or touch, by producing changes in nerve signals, which then affect the functioning of your brain. That process, going from sensory stimulus to changes in membrane potential, is the process of transduction. So every one of your senses has to have a transducer. Now that actually does lead to kind of some interesting philosophical issues, because I know that I feel like I'm seeing the world. But if what's really going on in my brain, the part of me that is conscious and aware of the world, is that all it's getting is patterns of action potentials, what is light, really? I feel like I experience it as vision. But if really that's just patterns of changes in action potentials, it kind of makes me feel like maybe my sensory perceptions are not exactly an accurate representation of the world. And actually, the more we study it, the more we realize that that is to some degree true. We talk about this a lot in one of the sensory labs, and so I encourage you to do that one. But just as kind of a way of thinking about that, we know that your senses are heavily interpreted. That when I see what I am experiencing, what we call my perception of sight, is not a direct feed from my eyes. The information coming, the light being transduced by cells in my eyes, is being filtered and interpreted before it gets to my cortex. And since my cortex seems to be where I have the conscious perception of sight, that means that what I am perceiving as vision is an edited and filtered version of what's actually there, which is an interesting thing to consider. Another interesting part of this is to think about, if the only thing my brain really gets is patterns of action potentials, could I fool my brain into thinking it was perceiving something by giving it patterns of action potentials? If I had a device which I could hook up to my optic nerve and it could stimulate those neurons in the right way, would I be able to feed my brain something which it would interpret as visual information? The answer is yes. In fact, people are working on that right now. There are in development prosthetics for the blind, depending on what causes you to be blind, which could provide effectively a camera replacing the function of the eye. The camera transducing light into electrical signals and then using that to stimulate nerve cells and send information to the brain, which the brain perceives as vision. So the idea of a prosthetic sense is absolutely possible. In fact, in development. In fact, well, hold that thought. Now, that does mean that every sense I have needs a transducer. If I talk about the sensory modality of sight, I need to find somewhere in here where there is a transducer that transduces light into action potentials. To talk about the sensory modality of touch, I need to find somewhere where I have transducers that transduce pressure or changes in pressure on my skin into nerve signals that my brain then interprets as touch. It also means that anything you can transduce can be a sense. So any kind of sensory information which can be turned into patterns of changes in nerve signals could be a sense that your body could use. And this opens up the really interesting idea of senses that you didn't have before. So as an example, with that idea of a visual prosthetic, if you could have your camera also transduce, say, infrared light, and turn that into patterns of action potentials, then your brain would be able to see that infrared light, or ultraviolet light, or radio waves, or whatever else you could transduce. This is an area that I am really interested in. In fact, I'm interested enough that I had this done. So in this finger, I had a very small magnet coated in a coating which makes it react okay with my body, implanted under the skin. And as the body healed, that magnet now, if I get close to a magnetic field, it moves slightly and it stimulates neurons in that finger, which were normally doing touch, which now sends a signal to my brain so I can feel when there's a magnetic field near that finger. And over time, I've learned it has a kind of a distinct feeling of its own. It's most like touch, but I'm not confused when I get near a magnetic field as to whether I'm touching something or feeling that field. So I have a sense now of magnetoreception that I didn't have before because we built a transducer for it. People are working on all sorts of interesting things like that. So just some interesting stuff with that, and it brings up some interesting philosophy, some interesting ideas about what are senses and what does it mean to be conscious of them. So we talk a little bit more about in the lab for this part. You might be interested in that. Now, let's talk about what kind of senses humans have. So if I were to ask you to list the human senses, you'd probably come up with a list like this: vision, hearing, smell, taste, and touch. We're sort of told that those are the 5 human senses. Kinda. Yeah, sort of. So, we could really take one out of here. There's another one that is clearly a regular sense of ours that isn't really like any of these others, but for some reason we usually group it under touch, and that's temperature. So really, there's at least 6. But what I'm going to tell you is there's more than that. Now, what other things might count as a sense? As information about either the outside world or our own body that goes to the brain? Well, another one that often comes up is balance. Or sometimes equilibrium, or closely related acceleration, the sense of that my body is being moved one way or the other. Also, kind of similar to that, is the idea of proprioception. This is one that we don't usually think about, but it's really interesting. Proprioception is your sense of body position. So my ability to go like that and touch my nose without looking is dependent on my ability to know where my hand is. So think for a moment, how do you know that? I have a sense of where my body is. And I can, when I my body moves around, I can feel it moving, and that tells me where my hands are. I can visualize the position of my body. But how do I know? As it turns out, this is based on sensory receptors in your muscles and joints that are feeding information to your brain all the time about the tension in your muscle and the angle of your joints, which you have learned to build into a map of where your body is. So there are also some other senses. I'm going to make another list over here. A few things here. Now this one, it's not really exactly a sense for your nervous system. There's other stuff that's more involved in that. But these other ones, there are transducers in your body that transduce all of these signals into nerve signals. And you may think, that's not a sense. I don't have a sense of my blood osmolarity. I can't go, my blood feels a little hyperosmotic today. No, not consciously. But you do get thirsty. While these senses don't really produce a conscious perception because they're not processed in the cerebral cortex, they are still used by your brain to direct activities, to direct responses. We're going to talk about how some of these are used as we go on. Thus, they are senses, but they're not conscious senses. One reason I've divided these into these three columns is because one way that I find useful to think of these is in the idea of conscious senses, semi-conscious senses, and unconscious senses. The conscious senses are the ones whose perception makes up the world we live in. When I am awake and aware, I am seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, and feeling hot and cold. Those are the things that kind of make the world that my mind lives in. These senses, semi-conscious ones, are ones that we can become aware of. If I think about it, I can say, okay, where is my body? Where am I balanced? Am I level? But I don't usually do it consciously. Usually these inform my responses, but at an unconscious level. I can become aware of them, but I don't usually. And then these are the ones that I really have no conscious access to, but they are still used by my brain to direct responses in my body. Every one of these has to have a transducer somewhere, and you may even be able to think of others. So you might, for example, think of my sense of a sense of sadness or emotion. What I'm going to argue is that that's not really a sense. If something makes me sad, that's not information coming from the outside world into me. That's information about the thing. For example, if I read an article and it says that a loved one has died, I will probably feel sad. But the sadness is not coming from the thing I'm reading. The thing I'm reading is transduced, I get information, my brain processes it, and realizes something has happened which I'm unhappy about. The sadness is an internal state. An emotion is an internal state of the brain, not coming from outside. We don't know of any emotional transducers. We're not even sure how that would work. So as far as we know, that doesn't work that way. You might also, some people talk about psychic senses, like the ability to sense other people's thoughts or to see the future. While I am open-minded in theory about such things, to date, we do not have any solid evidence that such things really happen. There are a few interesting studies out there that suggest that there are some interesting possibilities that are probably worth investigating further. But so far, the evidence has generally been either that this does not exist or it is very noisy and weak and difficult to find. Most likely, the best attitude to have is that we don't have any evidence that this exists. So right now, we have not identified any of those as senses. You may have others. I'd be interested to hear about them if you have something that you're curious, is that a sense or not? But this is a decent list for many of the conscious, semi-conscious, and unconscious senses. Now, let's talk a little bit about the transducers involved in this. Oh, actually, before we do that, sometimes you will also hear people talk about the special senses and the general senses. So just for the moment, I'm going to remove these from this. I'm going to remove these at least from the list. Now, when people talk about special senses, they're talking about a sense for which there is one dedicated organ somewhere where the information from that sense comes in. So when people talk about special senses, they mean things like vision, where there's a specific organ, the eye, where that comes in, hearing, the ear, smell, taste, nose, and mostly mouth, although taste is kind of an interesting one. So when people talk about that, they're usually talking about the ones that have specific sense organs. Balance would also be on that list, served by organs in the inner ear. But the general senses are the ones where they're kind of more distributed. So, for example, touch, temperature, proprioception. Those would all be usually fall under the idea of general senses. Senses where there are sensory organs to bring that information in many places in the body. So touch and temperature all over your skin, proprioception through all of your joints and muscles. Now, there is another sense that I didn't put on this list, but that actually is a valid one, and that's the idea of nociception. And I didn't put it on here because all of these are really divided up into separate sensory modalities. Where a modality is really one type of input. It's something that we experience as one distinct kind of sense. So for example, sight feels very different to me than hearing. I experience them as different things. Proprioception is not the same as taste. Temperature and touch are closer, but I think you would still consider them separate modalities. I don't get confused whether something is sharp or cold. Nociception, though, kind of spreads out a little here. Nociception is the sensation of pain. So when I have a painful stimulus, I actually receive that on a particular kind of sensory receptor. But there are receptors that would be considered nociceptive, where stimulating them produces the sensation of pain, that kind of fall into many of these categories. There can be painful touches, or painful temperatures, or painfully loud sounds. So it's kind of harder to specifically put nociception in this list. But we would probably include it as a general sense. Because since there are multiple different kinds of nociceptors, you can get nociception in lots of places. So it would probably fall under general sense as opposed to a special sense. All right. Hopefully that makes some sense, haha, so to speak. Now, we've talked now about different sensory modalities, different kinds of stimulus that we experience as a distinct sense, and nociception, which is kind of not exactly its own modality, and yet kind of is, because pain is kind of common between all those things. Anyway, pain is actually an interesting one. Take a moment to talk about that. We generally think of pain as a bad thing, understandably. But there are occasionally people born without a sense of pain, and those people often either do not survive or have major problems, because really what pain is your body's way of telling you that there's something you really need to pay attention to, something which is a potential threat, which could be dangerous to you. So touches become painful when they could possibly do damage to you. Sounds become painful when they're dangerous to you, dangerously loud. So the problem with pain is not that it exists, it's that sometimes people have conditions where the pain won't go away even though they're not really in danger. Chronic pain like that is a major problem. It produces huge problems with quality of life. Some of you may even have some level of chronic pain. And if so, I am sorry for that. We can't easily ignore pain because it serves that protective function. It's their body's way of saying, pay attention to this. I'm not going to let you ignore this. But when you've got something that's causing you pain, but there's nothing you can do about it, all it does is cause you ongoing stress. The body's response to pain is interesting. The experience of pain is a mental thing. And if you've ever experienced a serious injury, I hope not, but if you have, you may know that in many cases when a person gets a serious injury, they don't feel a lot of pain right away. Almost as if the body says, okay, if you felt as much pain as this should really be causing you, you wouldn't be able to deal with the problem. So we're going to hold off on the pain and let you handle the threat. And then later, we'll give you a lot of pain so that you know to pay attention to it and make sure it gets fixed. Maybe? I don't know. It's just kind of a guess. But anyway, now that we've brought in nociception, let's go back here and talk a little bit about the different transducers that are involved in these senses. So we mentioned that every sense has to have a transducer. So let's talk about what kind of transducers we have. So different kinds of sensory receptors. And we can list these and then sort of match them up with some of these senses. So, if I have a sensory receptor which transduces light, I call that a photoreceptor. Photoreceptors transduce light. So which sense would that be involved in? That one's pretty easy. Vision. Okay. What about a transducer which responds to the presence of chemicals? We call that a chemoreceptor. So which senses would be served by chemoreceptors? When I look at that, definitely smell and taste. All right. How about ones which respond to temperature? Thermoreceptors. Well, makes sense these would respond to temperature, hot and cold. What about ones that respond to physical force, which we call mechanoreceptors? Mechanoreceptors are receptors which respond to some kind of physical force. Well, it would make sense that touch would be on that list. And as it turns out, proprioception is too. Proprioception, there's several different kinds of receptors, but they all respond to physical strain of some sort. Balance also served by mechanoreceptors. So we've covered everything except nociception, and we'll get to that in a moment, and hearing. Interestingly, hearing is actually mechanoreceptive. Sound is fundamentally pressure waves in the air. Those pressure waves vibrate your eardrum, which vibrates some little bones inside your middle ear, which push in and out on a fluid-filled space in the cochlea, which sloshes some fluid back and forth, which bends a little membrane, which bends little hair cells, which opens mechanically gated ion channels and produces changes in nerve signals. So fundamentally, hearing is a mechanoreceptive sense. You're responding to physical pressure waves in the air. I really wish we had time to go into hearing. Hearing is an absolutely fascinating sense in terms of how it works. But unfortunately, we're not. Now, nociceptors, the receptors which respond to pain, can be in several of these categories. You can have nociceptive chemoreceptors. So, for example, the chemoreceptors which respond to capsaicin, which is the chemical found in hot peppers or pepper spray. When they're stimulated, they produce sensations which your brain interprets as pain, which is why spicy stuff can feel like it burns. Or some thermoreceptors, which respond to heat or cold, can produce a feeling of pain. So nociceptors can actually be multiple types of these. Now, another interesting thing about this is that a given sensory receptor doesn't actually have to be just one of these. So, for example, the sensory receptors, which are chemoreceptive and respond to the presence of, say, menthol and mint type chemicals, are also, when they activate, they also send signals that we interpret as cold. So the receptors for that are kind of thermoreceptors and chemoreceptors. Likewise, the ones that respond to that pepper chemical, capsaicin, produce a sensation of heat. Here's another example that you might find interesting. And do this carefully, but carefully close your eye. Now, you can watch what I'm about to do. So open your eyes again. Now, I'm going to press very lightly here on the side of my eyeball. I can feel the shape of my eye here under my eyelid, and I'm just pressing in ever so slightly, and then moving my finger around. Try that. Don't poke yourself too hard, but try that out. Now, when I do that, I see a moving spot of kind of gray. But the funny thing is, when I'm pressing on my left eye, I see that on the right side of my vision. And when I move my finger down, it moves up, and when I move my finger up, it moves down, that little spot. I'm seeing that because some of the photoreceptors, the cells that respond to light in my retina, which we're going to talk about in a little bit, here in the back of here in my eye, are also responding to the physical force, the pressure. In other words, they're also kind of mechanoreceptors, although usually that's not important. But when I press on those and activate them, they are sending signals down my optic nerve to my thalamus and then to my visual cortex. And my brain doesn't know the difference if those signals are coming from the cell being poked or the cell getting light. So it says, hey, I'm getting signals on these axons. Therefore, I'm seeing something. So when I poke that, I experience vision. I experience I have the experience of some sort of visual stimulus because I'm activating the photoreceptors. The fact that they're not being activated by light is irrelevant. Kind of interesting. Now, why is it that I see it over on this side and it's moving opposite to my finger? We're going to talk about the anatomy of the eye soon here, and that may help make that make sense. Now, before we go on to that, I wanted to talk about a couple of other things. First, the idea of tonic versus phasic receptors. I'm going to erase this stuff right now. This term is usually used in application to general senses. Now, a sensory receptor is not just necessarily the neuron that's responding. It can actually be other stuff associated with it. So, for example, many touch receptors have dendrites, but that are encased in various other structures that change what kind of touch they respond to. In fact, you have multiple kinds of touch receptors. So really, in terms of touch, you have several different sort of sub-senses. You have a sense of vibration, pressure, stroking feeling, light touch. All of those are actually served by different kinds of sensory receptors. Interesting point, but anyway. The idea of tonic versus phasic receptors, usually applied to general senses, is whether that receptor continues to respond to a constant stimulus. So tonic receptors Sometimes we call these slow adapting. These respond, or actually I'm going to say that differently. These keep responding during a constant stimulus. So if we were to make a little graph here, so this is time, now we're going to say here is where the stimulus is present, starting at this point in time and continuing. A tonic receptor, if here's the response for my tonic receptor, will start sending action potentials. Each of these spikes is one action potential. And it may slow down some, but it will keep responding during that stimulus. Often you get another burst right when the stimulus ends. So this tonic receptor responds strongly when the stimulus starts and then continues to respond during this whole time. Tonic receptors, usually most nociceptors are tonic, most proprioceptors are tonic, and some kinds of touch are tonic receptors. So when I touch the board here, when I first touch the board, there are some kinds of touch that I feel very intensely right at first, and then they kind of fade out. But other kinds, like just the sensation of pressure on my fingertips, continue as long as my fingers are on the board. Pain receptors are usually tonic. If something is happening, like say someone pepper sprays you, you get continuous, it doesn't say, oh, it's there, you know what, forget it, and you adapt to it. No, not really, not very much at least. And proprioception is also tonic, that when I move my hand, I feel the sensation of my hand moving and my arm joints moving, but if I hold it still, I don't lose track of it. They continue to respond and say, nope, this is where we are, we're currently here, so I get a continuously updated map of my body. You may have experienced what it's like when you stop getting those proprioceptors. If your arm or leg falls asleep and you're no longer getting that feedback, it produces a weird sensation that you don't have a sense of where that limb is. Lack of proprioception actually produces some really weird effects sometimes. In people where the proprioceptors specifically are damaged, they can end up with the strong feeling that that limb isn't actually attached to them. This idea that that's not mine, which is very odd. But it actually makes sense. Very brief digression here. Proprioception doesn't really start showing up until I think it's the first couple weeks of life. Before that, people don't really have proprioception. And some of you may have had the joyous experience of watching a baby discover their hands. It's kind of fun. You look in when they're tiny and they may be waving their hands around, but that doesn't really do anything. But then you eventually look in and they're going like this. Like, oh my gosh, what are these? That happens at about the time that proprioception develops. And I think they're related. I think that before that, when this infant is lying there, they can see, their eyes work, they're blurry, but they can see. And there's all sorts of things that go by in the world. They know that sometimes this thing goes by, and sometimes that person walks by, and other things happen, and it all just looks like stuff going on in the world. But then, once proprioception starts to kick in, and their body sensors develop, they start noticing that, hey, when that thing moves by, I feel it. That has a sensation where when person walks by, I may like that person, but I don't actually feel the movement, whereas this has a sensation. They start to realize these are a different part of my world than that stuff. I think that before that, that baby didn't really have a sense that they were different from the world. Everything out there was equally a part of their world. They may not have really known they have a body. But once proprioception kicks in, they know that this is me in a way that that is not. That must be a really interesting thing to realize I am different from that. I wonder what that is like, to have that, to go from there is no separation, the world is just one big thing, to there's me and then there's that. But I'm guessing that comes from when proprioception shows up, which is kind of an interesting idea, in my opinion. Anyway, so those are tonic receptors. The idea of a phasic receptor. Let's see how we're going to do this. So here was our stimulus. This purple was our tonic receptor. So a phasic touch receptor, also known as fast adapting, phasic receptors stop responding after a little while if the stimulus doesn't change. So my phasic receptor will respond very strongly when the stimulus begins, and probably again when it ends. But if the stimulus just keeps going, the phasic receptor stops responding pretty quickly. So when I touch this, some of those receptors go, oh, we're touching something, and we're still touching it, never mind. And I stop getting that sensation. While this is usually applied to the general senses, smell receptors are notoriously phasic. That if there's a smell and you're exposed to it for a little while, when you first get exposed, you go, oh my gosh, what is that? What is that smell? And then if it's still there, you stop responding to it pretty soon. Pretty soon, you don't notice it. You're really not getting that information. That's what getting used to that smell means. Until you go, all right, yep, still there, where you're forcing extra of that into your nose, so you sort of recalibrate what smells are out there. Interesting idea, but you've all experienced this idea of tonic versus phasic. So these are tonic, some touch are tonic. Temperature receptors are phasic. Generally, once you get used to a temperature, you stop feeling it unless the temperature changes. And some touch receptors are phasic. All right. Now, one last concept on this idea of sensory receptors, the idea of a receptive field. So for every sensory receptor, for every individual sensory receptor, we can characterize its receptive field, which is the range of stimuli that receptor will respond to. In other words, what can that receptor transduce? What kind of stimuli will cause that receptor to change membrane potential and send signals to the rest of the nervous system? So, receptive field includes things like the stimulus type or modality. So my photoreceptors, for example, do not respond to changes in temperature. So that changes in temperature are outside their receptive field. It can also involve intensity. For many receptors, the stimulus has to be at least a certain intensity before they will respond. Some of them won't respond if it's too much. So there are touch receptors which will not, there's some touch receptors will not respond to a very light touch. Others do. Or my olfactory receptors, there have to be at least a certain amount of that chemical in order for my olfactory receptor to respond. If the intensity is not right, that receptor doesn't respond. And remember, your brain only knows about what receptors tell it about. So if a stimulus that is too weak to get a receptor to respond, your brain will not perceive it. You will not have that part of your sensory world. It can also involve location. So the touch receptor here on my skin doesn't respond to sensations over here. That's how I can tell where sensations are. My brain over time has learned that when I get sensations from this particular receptor, that means that stimulus is located at this spot on my hand. You get some interesting stuff with that, with the idea of referred sensation. So for example, internal sensations often get referred to external areas, where when you get some sort of sensation at one point inside your body, you'll feel it as if it were coming from some particular place on your skin, which is kind of an interesting thing. That can also refer to things like light. So a photoreceptor at one place in my retina is only really going to respond to light coming from one particular place out in the world because that's how my eye focuses it. If my eye focused differently, or if something went wrong, I might get it being stimulated by light coming from the wrong place, and that could produce some interesting responses. So these are big parts of what characterizes a receptor's receptive field. It responds to a particular kind of stimulus of some particular intensity, or maybe at least some particular intensity, and from a particular location. That kind of defines the borders of your sensory world. The reason that I have no experience of what it's like to see ultraviolet light is because ultraviolet light does not fall within the receptive field of any of my transducers, of any of my sensory receptors. So my brain can't know anything about it. So hopefully that makes a little bit of sense. For the last part of this lecture, we're going to talk in detail about how the eye works, how photoreceptors work. We're going to do a little bit about the anatomy of the eye and the way the retina is put together and how the focusing mechanism works. And then we're going to talk in detail about how individual photoreceptors transduce light, because it's kind of a neat mechanism. So see you for that.